After failure, it is possible to keep going and to fail better. Last time on Praxology, we talked with pastor and first shepherd, Roman Toshek, where he engaged with some of his own previous failures. He showed how they were instrumental in moving forward. So does he align with this opening quote? Even more, is it possible to develop a spiritual discipline of failing? Tyler and I discuss this and more today on Praxology, where theology fuels the mission of the church. We are a collaboration between Formation College and Josiah Venture. Praxology is the place to help you think biblically, reflect theologically, and act missionally. And we're going to do that today in those exact three segments, but we're going to switch it a little bit. And really, we think of this as an outflow of recent episodes, and in transition to the next episode, where we're going to discuss more definitively the role of suffering within formation, and move towards character growth, of course. But before jumping into failure, I want to announce a special episode that's going to air late June to conclude our season. That's a question and answer session, Q&A, for those of you watching on YouTube and those of you listening via audio streaming device and platforms. Message us with those questions that you have from anything related to formation, growth, spiritual formation, any conception that you can think of that we've been airing and talking about together on this season. We want to hear from you. So send us your questions, praxology@formation.org.uk, and we'll feature them in that episode. Deadline is going to be May 31st, so get those questions in now while you're thinking about it, rather than saying, oh, I've got one for them, but I'm going to wait until later. Just send us that email, send us that message on Instagram even, and that works just fine. Speaking of which, shout out to Anna Beth Burnham for a great question on our Praxology Instagram page recently. And that's right, friends. We have Instagram and Facebook. No, we don't have Facebook yet.
We do have Facebook. But it just... Everything that goes on Facebook is just copied over from Instagram. Yeah.
See, I'm teaching myself some things. Give us a follow.
Yes.
Comments on those pages.
At Formation_EU on Instagram. Or you could just look up Formation European Online Campus on Facebook.
That works as well. The first way is maybe a little bit easier.
It's a little bit easier. It's a little bit cooler as well. You know, Instagram's the hip place to be. So they say. Probably not anymore.
Things are evolving. However, Instagram still works.
It works.
And just a special shout out to those of you who have commented, who are following along. Tell your friends, have them like the page as well, and send in some questions. So, Tyler.
Yeah.
Failure. Is it possible for failure to be turned from a negative idea into a positive one? Is failure positively formational?
Oh, my. I think we have to think about it differently. We have to try at least, because all of us fail. It's kind of a normal part of life. It's a normal part of our walk with Jesus is to not get it right all the time, and actually we learn the best. Some of the best lessons that we learn in life are when we fail, and then we get to reflect on it. So it's like I preached yesterday on Proverbs and the idea of moving from simplicity to wisdom. And if you're simple, which is not a bad thing, and you're trying to move on the path of wisdom, you're not going to get it right every time. But that's actually just fine, because it's a great opportunity to learn. So I think the question we need to be asking is, what does redeemed failure look like?
What does redeemed failure look like? Yes. And also you touched upon another theme. We really have, it's kind of been in several episodes, but not really discussed. Minimalism. As a form of simplicity can have positive value. But again, if we're simple people, that's something different.
That's right.
Just a note for our listeners. So after failure, is it possible to keep going and to fail better? That really assumes, I think, your question of, we'll say it one more time.
Yeah. What does redeemed failure look like?
Yeah. So that really is failing better. That assumes a positive. So speaking of it in a redeemed fashion. This quote by the way, comes from the renowned Slovenian philosopher and theologian, Slavoj Zizek. He is a fantastic philosopher, taken very seriously in very many circles. Difficult to understand sometimes, for several reasons. One of which is his brain is so large that sometimes things come out and it takes people like 5 minutes for their brain to catch up, to sync up with his brain.
Yes.
As it were. Since I cannot help myself, Tyler, we'll stick with the systematic stream for a while. We'll reflect or think theologically, and then we'll move to reflecting biblically. I'm messing it all up now. We will reflect theologically, and then
we'll think
after
biblically.
that think biblically.
As long as we get to the biblical stuff.
Of course, it's how can we reflect theologically without thinking biblically?
That's right. Can I read the quote just one more time, just in case the listeners missed it? It's so thought-provoking. After failure, it is possible to keep going and to fail better. Slavoj Zizek.
Yes. So
right,
we'll start with looking at that quote from the negative, because it's fun. So we'll look at the negative or opposite viewpoint regarding assumptions. The quote assumes that failure is a good thing. Mm-hmm. So let's actually assume we think failure is a bad thing. We'll take the opposite.
Sure.
What does this mean for Christians who I think actually are a lot of times afraid of failing? What does it mean for Christians if we take this negatively? If failure is bad, I think this is what it means. If failure is bad, then we must resist it to some degree, usually subconsciously. Often resistance here means, though, not doing something or not talking about something for fear of, I don't know, whatever. Mm-hmm. And the point to my apophatic delight, which is the process of what we are doing. Apophaticism, by the way, for those of you who are, some of you are nerding out right now, and some of you are completely lost. It's a type of phenomenology, studying experience, an experience of a human, and it's often used within systematic theology and philosophy. Zizek does it, so I'm giving this as tribute to him. The point is this. Implicit in this line of thinking is innocence. Resisting failure leads to innocence, particularly of the naive kind. Mm-hmm. Simplicity.
There you go.
It actually connects, I think, to what you were saying, that you were just preaching about yesterday. Now, Marika Rose has developed a theology of this in her book, A Theology of Failure, and she's writing using the conversation partner of Zizek, Against Christian Innocence, the subtitle. I'll read a portion from the book's description here. Rose proposes an account of Christian identity as constituted by, not despite, failure. Understanding failure as central to theology opens up new possibilities for confronting Christianity's violent and kyriarchal history and abandoning the attempt to discover a pure Christ outside of the grotesque materiality of the church. Now, kyriarchal is a Greek word turned English. It's like lording over. Mm-hmm. Something similar to that, in a bad way. I'm better than you, that sort of thing. Now, this fascinating book, I've only read portions of. I haven't completed the whole thing, but it discusses two sides of a coin: the cataphatic and the apophatic. In other words, positive and negative. We'll just use those terms moving forward. So something like positive aspects and negative. An example is Zizek's faithfulness and betrayal. He talks about these two things at the same time. And we think, well, is that possible? Yes, Peter. That's an easy example. I mean, maybe you think of one from the Old Testament quickly, but Peter's a good one to go to.
Moses is a good example as well. You know, like striking the rock and being, God continuing to use him, but not being able to enter the promised land anymore.
Yeah. And so another example then from Rose's text, desire aims for wholeness and repeatedly fails. Drive does the same thing, but failure is its goal. Let's say it one more time. There's a lot packed in. Desire aims for wholeness and repeatedly fails. Drive does the same thing, but failure is its goal. Let's unpack that. We seek to be like Christ, and yet we fail even while we have every spiritual blessing in Christ. Difficult to wrap our minds around, but it's a thing. Drive, on the other hand, is motivated or motivation to achieve, according to Rose and Zizek. So we're motivated, our spirit steeped in the Holy Spirit, motivated to be like Christ. Now, in critique, desire need not always be negative, as this sort of assumes, I think. See James Smith's Desiring the Kingdom as an example of that, where he's using, positively, desiring the kingdom is a positive thing inherently just in the title. So, maybe better put, we want to be like Christ, but fail, while also having the drive to continue to achieve seeing God face to face. What exactly does this mean then? I think failure is a necessary feature of growth. It's a long-winded way to say that.
Right. As you were talking, the parable of the talents came to mind.
Yeah.
Jesus is saying, it's better to risk and to try and maybe fail than just not to do anything at all because you're afraid of failing. Essentially, it's one aspect of the parable. There's much more there. So it's kind of a warning against a life of seeking innocence, avoiding failure and maintaining some sort of purity rather than stepping out boldly and learning from your mistakes, trying things, maybe losing, maybe failing, but also probably gaining quite a bit more.
Yeah, if we're seeking to avoid failure, we end up not doing something, and we end up with a type of naive discipleship, in a sense of it seems as if we're better than we actually are, but really we're just resisting those things that would help us to learn and grow even further, which is something that we're arguing for then is moving towards a positive aspect of this. So failure is a necessary feature for growth. It's inevitable, and if so, it can be used positively and not just negatively to affect our motivation to seek out our sin and destroy it and become like God, which is important. But also I think there's more that can be explored that Zizek and Rose are getting at. So when I think of drive, I think of the persistent widow who simply just doesn't give up. And we might get confused by that. It's like she's told not to do something and she doesn't care. She just keeps doing it and keeps asking the same question. But can we show this, Tyler, to be biblically sound, or are those constructive theologians just playing with words again? Too much philosophy involved and so forth.
Yeah, I'm curious if we can. I think before we move farther into some biblical examples, it's important to differentiate between sin and failure.
Yes.
That not all failure is sin. There is failure that is sin, absolutely. But not all failure is sin. It's kind of like we've conflated sin into a lot of different things. Failure is one of them. Another one is, for just a nugget, purity or impurity, being impure. It's an Old Testament framework that when we read about, we see that somebody's impure and has to, wash themselves, that we think that's sinful. It's actually not. It's just life. Yes. You get dirty in life. You do stuff. It's important to wash yourself and keep going. Just
go on the street, go on a dirty, dusty street, and walk around all day with your bare feet.
Yeah, exactly.
There's the point.
Yeah, and there's that sort of physical dirt, and there's also moral dirt as well that just accumulates. And actually, so maybe that's actually a good parallel. Being impure is not sinful inherently, but it's important to wash yourself, to do what God has asked, and to move forward and re-enter the community and even enter into worship, enter into God's presence and keep going.
Yeah,
so
that is interesting. There's a feature then of our minds and what we think and believe about the Old Testament law and the purity system around it that even somehow factors in, it seems like, to our own formation. So theology obviously connects there, and how we view Scripture. And somehow, I it's a fascinating thought. I don't know. I don't have a fully formed idea at this point of it connecting to the idea of failure, but I think there's something happening there.
Yeah, well, one major theory about the purity system and even the system of laws in the Old Testament is that it is a formation tool. It's a teaching tool. It's not primarily about, God is super nitpicky, and so he just wants Israel to do a bunch of things. He's actually giving them these laws so that they become a certain type of people who care about certain types of things. And so it would totally make sense that there's the sacrificial system, which is meant to deal with sin and evil in the community. That's maybe what we're more comfortable talking about or comfortable thinking about. But there's also this system for just dealing with everyday failure, and it's not always a bad thing. Like when what's a good example? If you touch a dead animal, like is that a bad thing? No, it's just life. You like, oh shoot, I touched my dead dog. I don't know. That's a little intense, but
just a little, yeah.
Okay, all right. Now I have to do something about it. I didn't mean to. Didn't hurt anybody, but now I gotta learn. Gotta move forward. Can't enter God's presence before I make good on it. Before I learn from my mistake or learn from this experience and keep going. So
there's a good differentiation there that I think is helpful for us not to view that ritual purity system as I'm sinful, therefore I must X, Y, Z. And in some cases, yes, and in some cases we're saying that's not the intention behind the purpose.
That's right. But maybe bringing it a little bit closer to those of us listeners, or those of our listeners who are engaged in ministry, there's a lot we can learn from the office of the prophets in terms of failure. The prophets often had a really high calling to speak God's truth into specific cultural and historical moments, to kind of bring God's vision for his people and put it in a way that made sense to where the people were at in a particular moment. And there are these amazing calls, when the prophets get called by God, it's pretty striking. Let's take Jeremiah as an example. God shows up in Jeremiah chapter 1 and says, "Before I formed you, I knew you, I set you apart, I appointed you to be a prophet for the nations." And Jeremiah, probably a teenager, immediately says, "I don't know how to speak. I haven't been trained. I'm not old. I don't have lots of skill."
Sounds familiar also.
It does sound familiar.
Back to Moses.
Yeah, very much so. And God says, "It's okay. It's okay. Don't say that, like, it's not about your age, because the point is I'm going to put my words into your mouth." And it's pretty amazing. God basically gives him a certain authority that actually is his own. In verse 10 of chapter 1, he says, "See, today I appoint you over nations and kingdoms to uproot and tear down, to destroy and overthrow, to build and to plant." This crazy, amazing vision of, okay, put my words inside you, you're going to speak them, and things are going to happen. The world is going to change. But especially with a person like Jeremiah, it doesn't go so smoothly. And Jeremiah fails not necessarily because of his own, because he did something wrong. He fails for other reasons. In chapter 7, God gives Jeremiah a really difficult message for the people,
to say the least.
Just oh my goodness. It's really, really intense. And he gets through and he talks about how stiff-necked they are and how they're just they need to get their act together. And then at the end in verse 27, he says, "When you tell them all this, they will not listen to you. When you call to them, they will not answer."
So in other words, his success before God is failing.
That's right.
Yes.
So you have to do this, and actually no one is going to care. And that's actually success and failure at the same time, like you're saying. So he's a prophet. He's sent by God so that the people change and reform their ways and turn back to God, and yet he's sort of destined to fail. And Jeremiah in particular takes this pretty hard. Actually, Jeremiah has I think a dozen or more cases where God tells him or God talks about the fact that the people will not listen. Just is littered all throughout. Like they're not going to listen. They're not going to listen. I tried. They didn't listen. And yet Jeremiah is called to continue, to keep going, to keep failing, essentially. So I have another passage that reflects on his own experience of this failure. But do you have any reflections on this so far?
I do, but I'll bring it in when
Okay.
I'm going to open up Mark for us here in a little bit, and something connects, but I want to speak out of turn.
Yeah. Okay, great.
Stay in the Old Testament here.
So in Jeremiah chapter 20, he reflects on this experience of just a perpetual failure, essentially. Like, he talks to God in pretty brutal terms and basically says, he does say in chapter 20, verse 7, "You deceived me. You tricked me. You overpowered me and prevailed. I'm ridiculed all day long. Everyone mocks me. Whenever I speak, I cry out, proclaiming violence and destruction. And what's that brought me? The word of the Lord has brought me insult and reproach all day long." He's like, God, you set me up. You told me that this was going to happen, and you told me that you called me. You told me that you gave me this great mission, and that you're gonna put your words in me, and all it's brought me is just pain and frustration because nobody cares. And yet he has an internal tension. A little bit later he says, his word is in my heart like a fire shut up in my bones. Actually, it was backing up. He says, but if I say, I won't mention his word or speak any more his name, his word is in my heart like a fire shut up in my bones. I'm weary of holding it in. Indeed, I cannot. So he's experiencing this tension of like, I'd love to just say, thanks, God. It's been a good ride. I'm done. And yet he still has this calling, the fire that's inside him, the word of God that has been placed inside him. He can't hold it in. He has to let it out. So he's kind of doomed to a life of perpetual failure. And then he goes on and he is like, I wish I was never born. It's pretty rough. So it's not really a good experience for him. So, yeah.
Yeah, but in this case, just to go back to the theological portion,
yeah.
If failure is bad, then we resist it. That's how we took the negative of the quote. Here it's disproven. It literally failure in this case becomes unfortunate, but also not inherently in the automatic sinful bad route, which is something that we have to wrap our heads around, especially as we're talking about like character growth, spiritual formation, these kinds of matters. Anything else you want to add before we jump forward?
Yeah, just the final thing is that in the midst of all of this, it's the hope for future restoration is actually found in the present failure. For Jeremiah and for the people of Israel, it's to Jeremiah that God gives the promise that 70 years of exile will happen and then they'll be brought back. And so it's basically saying you're going to fail. Even Jeremiah, you're not going to see this, the good of this in your lifetime. But if we walk through this failure well, there is a possibility of return. There's a possibility of future hope. So,
ooh,
yeah.
Bringing in some eschatology.
There we go.
Well done. Let's move into the New Testament then.
Take us there.
And in connection, we'll stay with Mark's gospel. Jesus does a lot of things in Mark's gospel, and one of them that he's quite famous for is calling out lack of faith. Now, are some of those failures in the lack of faith sinful? I think so.
Yeah.
In every case, it's kind of just normal.
Mm-hmm. Kind of expected.
it's almost like over-realizing or overstepping boundaries to automatically go from failure, therefore sin. I basically what we're centering around at this point is pause before taking that next, what seems like logical step, because there could be a lot more things going on. One example, Mark chapter 4, verse, where is it? 40.
Mm-hmm.
Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith? This is after Jesus calms the storm. Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith? And continuing, and they were filled with great fear and said to one another, who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him? Okay, let's pause. Actually, you were in Israel recently, so you can, Tyler, very vividly portray where they were at.
Mm-hmm.
And this place is a massive sea. It's about this, half the size of the Atlantic Ocean, right? Absolutely not.
Nope.
This is super small little.
It's a little lake.
It's not really even a sea. It's actually a lake.
It is a lake. You can see it to the other side
easily.
Yeah.
And then once every, I think it's afternoon, there's a wind that comes in and kind of stirs up the waters, but usually otherwise it's really calm.
Yeah, it is.
And so this is kind of odd, out of place, very, very out of the ordinary. And so to an extent, I mean, the disciples have these automatic processes going on in their bodies that they cannot help. It's like when you fight or flight mode. That actually inherently is a good thing for our bodies, and they're going through something like that, and so that's where in some of the part I think where fear comes in, and that can't be blamed. Now, if they're then consciously thinking and going, I've seen this, and this, and then consciously rejecting, then that would be, I would say, outright moving towards sin.
Yep.
But the fact that they were filled with fear and said, who is this guy? In a way, is kind of just like trying to reconcile what just happened. This place, this sea, lake, never gets crazy.
Yeah.
That was crazy. This guy just basically just spoke a word and everything calmed down instantly. What is happening? Even if they had a thought bubble of containing thoughts of Jesus is this, that just blew it out of the water, quite literally. But we see here Jesus simply saying, do you still not have faith? Maybe we shouldn't, but I often wonder this. What's Jesus's tone?
I know. I was just thinking about that too.
This is something that we are thinking biblically at this point, and part of that's an interpretation. When we're reading the biblical text, how do we picture the tone of what's being said?
Yeah.
I think a lot of that comes from our own past experiences, if I had to guess, as well as potentially some lack of knowledge about certain cultural situations of the Bible, and so on and so forth. Anything you want to say there? Just sort of as an aside before we go into Mark chapter 6.
Oh, there's a couple of rabbit trails I could go down, but I think one of the ones is that questions like this. Okay, so there's a Telly Lau from Trinity has written a book on shame recently, on the positive nature of shame. We see shame as a really bad thing, but Paul uses shame quite explicitly in some of his letters to motivate people, and Jesus seems to as well sometimes. And it's easy for us to read this and be like, Jesus, you're being really mean, like you're making me feel bad. But we could also see this as a way of kind of reaching into the depths of the disciples' psyche or their emotional life, and trying to stir something up, trying to help them reflect and realize something that they're blind to, not out of frustration, not out of desire to hurt, but out of desire to help them grow. So, why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? It's very different than hearing it like, why are you so afraid? Why don't you have any faith? Like the
attacking. Do you not remember yesterday?
We just talked about this. No, we don't know what Jesus' tone was, but we can understand some of the cultural ways of communicating, which include shame and not just being a bad thing.
Yeah. Only use of shame, bad thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
But we can fairly simply show that Jesus doesn't do that. In fact, I'll move in the direction and say Mark chapter 6, I think, kind of shows that. It's not, there's a more subtle aspect of shame, if we're going to say that. Sort of a minimal affirmation type of idea. Jesus feeding the 5,000. Very instrumental text here. Do you have it? I think you've got a better version in front of you than me. So do you want to read 30 to 44?
In chapter 4?
Chapter 6.
Chapter 6, thank you.
Jesus feeding the 5,000.
The better version.
Well, this is some confusing language.
I know.
Part.
Great. 30 through what?
40,
through the end?
44.
Okay. The apostles gathered around Jesus and reported to him all they had done and taught. Then, because so many people were coming and going that they did not even have a chance to eat, he said to them, "Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest." So they went away by themselves in a boat to a solitary place. But many who saw them leaving recognized them and ran on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he began teaching them many things. By this time it was late in the day, so his disciples came to him. "This is a remote place," they said, "and it's already very late. Send the people away so they can go to the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat." But he answered, "You give them something to eat." They said to him, "That would take more than half a year's wages. Are we to go and spend that much on bread and give it to them to eat?" "How many loaves do you have?" he asked. "Go and see." When they found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. Then Jesus directed them to have all the people sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups of hundreds and 50s, taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to his disciples to distribute to the people. He also divided the 2 fish among them all. They all ate and were satisfied, and the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces of bread and fish. The number of the men who had eaten was 5,000.
12 baskets, one for each of them.
Yeah, that's right.
Some subtle things there. Is
my.
Wow, Jesus is taking care of them. Maybe that's interpreting a little bit too much into the text. Nonetheless, towards that idea, you were just saying a few minutes ago about being blind. And I think the remedy for that is having the right foresight. We see that here in Mark chapter 6. Mm-hmm. So and many people, several people coming into mind, they describe faith as a seeing as.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Which it just makes sense. Like there's mediating factors, and one of them is the fact that we have bodies and we see. So faith is literally a seeing as, and we can go further, but the point is simply to connect sight with blindness here. And we saw Mark chapter 4. He's trying to get them to see in ways that they're blind. Like, do you not have faith? And we see the same thing here.
Yeah.
Except Jesus' tone it appears to be quite different, more subtly shameful. I don't know that I don't know that I would actually say that for here in Mark. But he's using this as a teaching tool, effectively. And also, by the way, we see in verse 33, many people were running on foot. I'm gonna go on record and say that I love the aspect of running, and Tyler does not like it.
Nope, we're talking about running before we started recording.
That's why.
And I was like, "What? How fast are you running?" I have no frame of reference for that.
I'm thinking of embarking on training for a marathon, so that's why this discussion was had, and I'm thinking of it here in verse 33 as a way of like maybe the response could be, but they were running for a purpose. They wanted to see the end result, and so do I. It's the finish line. So running is a good thing.
Okay.
When the people catch up, Jesus effectively feeds them, but the process is what's important here. So beginning in verse 35, it grew late. They're in the middle of nowhere. The disciples point that out. Jesus, this is a desolate place. We're in the middle of nowhere right now. I'm looking at my watch, and it's kind of late. We need to do something about this.
There's no bistro nearby.
There's no snack stand.
They
nothing.
didn't pack a lunch.
So they give their own sight, what they see. Send them away to go buy some food. Like, there's no restaurants here, but over there is. So send them away so there's still time before they close. Right?
Yeah.
And Jesus responds. He doesn't say, "Oh, ye of little faith." He simply says, in a statement, "You give them something to eat." He's trying to show them in the moment, your sight is not my sight. You need my sight. You're blind. I'll give you sight. So faith brings that sight. And it's what he's trying to instill in them. And they then say, proving his point from Mark chapter 4, in part that not that they have lack of faith, but faith is connected with seeing, and they don't see correctly. They're in process of figuring that out, which ultimately they figure out like after the resurrection, and then they have to figure out the ramifications of that moving forward, just like we do. Shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to them to eat? That's like a lot of money.
Yeah.
Where do we come up with that? And then, again, Jesus is basically saying, you're asking the wrong question. You're talking to me. See me. See who I am. The same person who calmed the storm can very easily conjure up some food, provide another miracle, do what's necessary. And we see here that Jesus actually wants to. Like he's getting them to see the fact that he wants to do something about the situation. But he also thinks that what's really important is moving closer to the heart of the disciples and drawing them into it, which is remarkable. When we talk about formation, what Jesus is doing in this moment is spectacular. And then he asks, how many loaves do you have? Go and see. So they're going to look, right? They said 5 and 2 fish. And then he told everybody, sit down, please. How does that work without a bullhorn? Like,
that little game of telephone.
I was going to say it's the first game of telephone. Right here's the first game of you tell this person, and hopefully by the end people understand they're eating fish instead of like some other wild animal that would not have been clean, which wouldn't have happened. So he commanded them to sit down. So they sat down by hundreds and fifties. And taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven, said a blessing, from which the miracle then is provided. God in conversation with himself. And the Spirit then disperses through the disciples a miracle to the people. They ate and were satisfied. There's so much happening between verse 38 and verse 39. 5 and 2 fish. Then he commanded them all to sit on the grass. It's like the conversation stops. And it goes from Jesus showing them they're not seeing correctly to just having them participate in it. Which is kind of an interesting thought of participation becoming... Well, it's how we talk about acting missionally. And if faith is truly a seeing as, then it has to be practiced. I'm not just going to go run a marathon in September and start training, in August. That would be crazy. It's a development of a whole process where we have to whip our entire bodies into shape. That's more of a negative illustration. But it's not just willing my mind per se to do it. And Jesus gets that. It's like, he understands where they are. He understands the situation, the time, and helps them to see better, see more clearly, and ultimately take away their blindness, which Mark so painfully reminds us that they have the entirety of the gospel, and to the point of concluding it with, I would say, the shorter version.
Yeah. For sure.
And not having some of the latter part of chapter 16 there.
Yep. Ending with doubt.
Ending with everybody running away. Basically, to sort of really communicate that point. But we do see Jesus throughout this utilizing the failure of the disciples. And Jesus didn't fail in his teaching style. I think he ultimately accomplished it, but we're looking at a long process as opposed to just in the moment. I think sometimes if maybe we're in the moment, like, oh, this happened, I'm a failure. We bring shame upon ourselves, which is usually negative shame and never helpful, because we're not seeing correctly. And I don't mean, I mean seeing more in the faith sense. In the faith sense. Yeah. Perfect.
For sure.
And so in that sense, failure becomes not only necessary, but actually just part of discipleship. And if that's the case, let's spend a few minutes wrapping this episode up. What's the point? What do you think?
Well, this totally changes how we can approach our own failure if we take these especially these stories from Mark as kind of an example of how to engage it. Then, if, probably the first question we need to ask ourselves, we need to hear Jesus's voice, helping us maybe realize that we are not seeing correctly, that we don't have the faith that we should. But also we ought to see our failure as perhaps an opportunity for Jesus to do something really special, to bring about a miracle, not just to bless us. Maybe that's the 12 basketfuls. Okay, we're gonna grow in some way. We're gonna be taken care of, but also a whole bunch of other people are blessed as well, and in a sense brought about because the disciples didn't see enough, but were invited into a process of seeing through Jesus' eyes and seeing their failure as the start of something bigger. So,
and this was caught up in a whole lot of practicing certain things, not just sitting down and learning. It was a mixture of both. Jesus did teach. And we see here that Jesus is, again, I'm going back to, you give them something to eat. He's helping them to see rightly, and basically that they're missing the guy that's standing right in front of them. I wonder if things like that happen, and the disciples reflect on that later. I mean, probably they're going to go, oh, that's right. Jesus did do X and Y and Z before, and I couldn't see it. How could I? Whatever. And putting all of this extra shame upon ourselves. But maybe it's worth just remembering how the growth process works. And I don't know, like a type of liturgy of questioning. Why was it that I missed that? Because the answer might not always be because I knew better. If the answer is because I knew better and I willfully chose not to, now we're talking about sin.
Yep.
But it simply could be that this is fairly early in the process of Jesus' ministry, and they're still learning and growing. Just like, if you're a believer for 15 years, what you do 2 years in is different than what you do 13 years later. And that's just sort of how the growth process functions and works, and is a major testimony to the patience of God.
It is.
The patience that Jesus has with the disciples in Mark 6 is the same patience that he has with you who are listening in and joining us in this conversation, as well as with Tyler and I, of course. And so with that in mind, we adopt that posture then of not always seeing failure as a negative, failure as a learning experience. And questioning what happened, why was that happening, and then see in the Spirit where that might lead.
Yeah.
In that sense, everything becomes an opportunity. It's true. You fail. There's an opportunity for something that you can do next that you couldn't have done before unless you had the failure. And so there's at least two ways that we can see it, and I'm suggesting we do both, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's what we teach our students in formation, teach them to reflect on their experiences, to ask, why? Why did this happen? What was the significance? What can I learn? What can I do differently? It also brings to mind a friend of ours, Mikhail Novotny, who's a great Christian thinker, also a lawyer here in Czech, who has a practice of asking 5 whys. And so when I sit down with him, it's somewhat frustrating, but also really, really helpful. He'll ask me a question, and I'll give him an answer, and he'll say, why? And so I'll answer again, and he'll say, why? And I'll try and answer, and he'll ask, why? It helps get deeper and deeper past the outer layers to really the heart behind it, and is an invitation to really reflect. So it's actually a really valuable little exercise.
Yeah, and that connects with our Claire Patty takeover episode. We talked about childlike faith, and here we can connect into that and say that it's not questioning for the sake of deconstructing, but it's rather for discovery.
Yeah.
And if Jesus said, let the children come to me, and he deals with people as he does in the disciples in Mark chapter 6, then questioning is a very valuable source of learning. And really, in many ways, we can only question because we don't know something, or because we know and we wonder how it connects to something else. But there's always in questioning an element, not of doubt, just of not knowing. Mm-hmm. And in that, there's this inherent idea that it's possible to fail, that we do the best with the knowledge that we have at the time, but what if, so on and so forth. So let the little children come to me.
Ask all the questions they want.
fail well.
And fail well.
And ask a lot of questions. So in closing, if we can maybe sort of tongue-in-cheek, I suppose, borrow from Martin Luther, who said something along the lines of, if you're going to sin boldly. I think in like manner, I actually don't, something about that quote I don't like, but I want to change it here. If you're going to fail boldly. Because, again, failure is not always looking God in the face and saying, absolutely no, I'm doing it my way. That would be sin. So if you're going to fail in a positive sense, fail boldly. And ask questions in God's presence to be able to grow. Now, playing on this theme, because we're centering around failure not always being sin, again, that's the key. Next episode, we're going to turn from failure to notions of suffering. Sometimes we suffer as a result of our own failure. But there's also a broader discussion to be had within spiritual formation, which is where we're heading on next episode. We hope that you'll continue this journey with us. And for now, go in peace and in the ultimately successful failure of your endeavors in the Spirit of God. Blessings until next time.
Blessings.